Hi, and welcome to Ethnographic Imagination Basel, a series on reimagining the world from the mundane. My name is George Paul Meiu, and in this episode, we will talk about memory, how and why things are remembered and forgotten in different social and political contexts. Our guest is Jennifer Cole, whose work on colonialism, rituals, and ancestors in rural Madagascar has been central to debates on memory, not only memory as an individual phenomenon, but as a collective one. So stay tuned for a conversation on how the workings of memory shed light on the workings of our worlds. Jennifer Cole is professor in the Department of Comparative Human Development at the University of Chicago. A social anthropologist, Jennifer has researched a wide set of themes including memory and forgetting, youth, age and generation, love, gender and sexuality, as well as affect and kinship in contexts of transnational migration. She is author of numerous books and articles, including the monograph Sex and Salvation, Imagining the Future in Madagascar, published in 2010. In this episode, we will focus on her first book, Forget Colonialism, Sacrifice and the Art of Memory in Madagascar, published in 2001 by the University of California Press. A warm welcome to you, Jennifer. We are delighted you accepted our invite and glad to have you here.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to participate in the series.
Let us start with a very simple question. What is memory? The common sense definitions, and probably everybody has some common sense definition of it, psychologizes it. It's about the individual. It's your mind. It's what you can remember or can't remember. But we're also seeing more and more, I think, in the present, an emphasis on collective memory, collective trauma, collective violence, memories of dispossession. As anthropologists, how would we think or should we think about memory?
So I wouldn't, so first of all, I think it's useful to go back to just to say a little bit more about how psychologists think about memory and the kind of metaphors that we've had for a very long time, at least in Western cultures, about memory as related to storage, right? When psychologists talk about memory, and I think in general, we're always using memory in three ways, right? One is it's where you store things, right? So think about computer. How much memory are you buying in a computer, right? It is the content of those memories, right? And then it is also the fact that you can have storage, right? Have those things. When anthropologists talk about it, they're really building on a lineage of thought that's coming out of sociology and that ties back to Maurice Halbwachs. And Halbwachs was a student of Durkheim's, right? The French sociologist. And Halbwachs basically argued that you didn't have memories if you didn't have a group, right? And that group identity and memory were fundamentally tied to one another. And his early studies were about space and space acting as kind of an anchor for memory. But he looked specifically at the anchors that were associated with the New Testament, right? And he showed that as memories or as groups change, memories change, right? But Halbwachs didn't have, and this is sort of the legacy of Durkheimian thought, there wasn't a very strong idea of power, of differences within groups, right? And what you really see in contemporary society, and the way I think anthropologists think about memory now, is to look at the practices through which remembering occurs, right? Or commemoration, which is a great word, right? It's and to remember, right? So it's an active, it focuses on remembering. But commemoration, how that acts to anchor group identities and also to create claims, right? So I think in the current era, you see a lot of debates about memory because I think there's an acute awareness of the saying that George Orwell said, which is that he who controls the past controls the future. He who controls the present controls the past, right? And the links between those. So all of the debates around memory, I think, turn around those kinds of ideas, right? That I think are very, very central to how anthropologists have thought about it. But generally, anthropologists have tended to look at the social practices around ritual, around buildings, but also laws, right? Think about the new laws in France that, say that there is going to be some kind of commemoration to the history of slavery in that country, right? So there are many different ways and social domains in which memory or remembering can happen. And I think it's always tied to politics and always tied to the politics of the present. And I think that would be the kind of fundamental anthropological way of approaching it. Now, how should we approach it? I think that in my own work, I've sort of argued for attention to both the social dimensions of individual memory and the individual dimensions of social memory, and tried to see how those come together in social practice. So that's been my way of sort of entering into those debates.
So the two are not separate, but they can, methodological emphasis, you could look at personal memories of livelihood or life course, what have you. Mm-hmm. And of course, that is already socially shaped. What we remember and forget is socially shaped. But on the other hand, what do we remember or call forth in the present as a group?
Right. So so that again comes to, so when our individual memories are shaped, they're shaped because, when you go to school as a little kid, you're asked to say certain things about your family. You're asked to say, those memories are molded and shaped. There are also certain qualities about memory, like it is linked to difficult events, right? Or very striking events, right? People talk about flashbulb memories, or psychologists talk about flashbulb memories. And many people have a memory of where they were in 2001, for example, when the Twin Towers. There's also been studies on like where people were when Kennedy or when Martin Luther King got shot, right? And there have been studies showing like, where, how you remember those things is very much tied to your group positions in different ways, and or when the Capitol was stormed would be another one, right? Recent events that are very powerful and painful tend to create these very intense memories, right? So those are, in some ways, there's both a kind of psychological dimension to that, and then there are the social practices that allow that to gel and to become codified in a kind of schema, right? That exists, I think, in an uneven relationship to the public commemorations, right? So we can all have a personal relationship to something that's a little bit different than what's publicly out there. And it's the kind of unstable relationship, I think, between those two aspects that give it such dynamism, right? As like a social domain where you can kind of predict what people will say, but not entirely, right? Because there is an element of personal memory that's a little bit different, and we're all positioned in relationship to events a little bit differently.
So if we were to talk a bit now about Forget Colonialism and how it came into being, how did you come to be interested in memory as a research topic? And how did you come to be interested in particular dynamics of memory in Madagascar, in rural Madagascar? When the idea for this book emerged? Right.
So I came to Madagascar before memory. I became very interested in Madagascar because I studied with somebody, Maurice Bloch, who had written in part about ritual, but he in the beginning of his book, he talks about the kings and queens of Madagascar and the ways in which they tried to appropriate the legacy or the tools that came from the missionaries, right? They appropriated writing and used it in the service of their own empire. They appropriated, weapons from and used it in the service of their own expansion. And I was like, I really admired these kings and queens. And I love this cultural dynamic where you saw people incorporating things and then from the outside, but then kind of digesting them and using them to their own ends in particular ways. And it's very, very visible in the history. And so I knew I wanted to work in Madagascar. I also knew I had a long-term tie to France. And I was very interested in, at the time when you started to do an anthropology degree, you had to learn a written language and an oral language. Malagasy is written, but you had to sort of learn two, a field language and a written language. And so I already spoke French, and I really wanted to have ties to the legacy of the French Empire. I was interested in that. And so I ended up going to Madagascar, and I looked around, I did several different, visits to different areas of the island. At first, I thought I would do schooling and nationalism. And then I ended up on the East Coast, and I happened to end up in a in a village on the East Coast where a very famous sociologist, Gerard Altab, had done this study called Oppression and Liberation in the Imaginary that was done in this village like right after, in what people call the sort of neo-colonial period in Madagascar, so in the 60s. And there were these men, and I knew they had been involved, not these particular men per se, but I knew this area had been very much involved in the rebellion. And there were these men talking about how nostalgic they were for the French. And I was like, this is very strange. Like, and I didn't understand, I sort of my interest was piqued by that. Now, if my interest was piqued by that, it's partly because there was also a movement within anthropology at the same time to think about the legacies of colonialism and to do a kind of historical anthropology and to bring together history and anthropology, right? So I'd say that those threads, both the kind of empirical experience that I had there and the kind of puzzle that emerged, and then the sort of discussions going on in anthropology, which made that seem like something that was worthwhile, I think that's how I came to it.
Well,
So.
in the opening of your book, you say that at the point you were in anthropology as a student, already questions of colonialism, history, the empire more generally were already central to what was being taught and discussed in classes and so on. And you did have a sense that there is no way the past could not have been central to the project that you do, especially in the aftermath of French colonialism there. But you also share this very interesting narrative of arriving and looking for the past, and the past seemingly at the beginning not being that relevant, or not relevant the way you thought it should have been relevant or could have been relevant. So you were looking for it, but not in the ways or in the places where it was actually playing out. Can you say more about that?
Sure. I mean, I think, first of all, that experience, I think, is very general to anthropology. I think that you go with a project and it doesn't show up the way you think it's going to show up, but then it ends up showing up in some way that is related. And that's the sort of value of fieldwork, that it pushes, you go out with certain ideas and then the world pushes against those ideas. In this case, I chose a particular village where I ended up working. And I have to say, like, at the time I went to Madagascar to do this fieldwork, it was already not considered fashionable to do village fieldwork. It was already a little bit passé and, strange. And but I really was interested in the question, excuse me, of historical memory and of how people were going to remember the past. So I went there and I chose a place where I knew from historical records that the rebellion had been intense. I knew people had died. I knew it was majorly along the East Coast, along areas of Madagascar where forced labor had happened and where settlers had been, that peasants in particular had risen up. And I got there and I found the village I ended up working in a little bit by chance. I had to go in by official channels, but it was basically like I'd gone into a village that looked like it had been invented by, kind of old-fashioned anthropology. Now, partly that's because at the particular moment that I went in the early 90s, there was the state was in a kind of moment of withdrawal, right? Yeah. There was a period in which, the state was very poor after years of structural adjustment, and people couldn't, it was barely evident. And people had and the peasants didn't want the state imposing on them. They weren't getting much for their tax dollars, such as they were, right? And so when I went there, people really didn't want to, it's not that they wanted to, they would talk to me, right, about stuff if I asked them, but it wasn't like it mattered to them, right? Yeah. And then, as I narrate in the book, at a certain point, these elections happened. And the elections were sort of the mark of the neoliberal state and the mark of a renegotiation from the older socialist state that had taken over Madagascar in 1975 and the kind of reconfiguration that happened after the fall of the Soviet Union, like in so many places. At that moment, there was this huge effort to mobilize people. And at that moment, people started to talk about the rebellion spontaneously, right? And so it's sort of what frames my book and what sort of framed my understanding of the topic is the tension really between, the fact that it was visible, not visible sort of in the structure of the town, in certain casual ways that people would address me, but not particularly salient or relevant, to a moment when it was powerfully relevant and very, very painful. And so my book is really trying to understand what are the social practices that allow you to go between those two extremes. When do the things that you use to shape the past work? When do they fail? How do you think about that?
Yeah. But the interesting element here is also one of a certain kind of intensity or magnitude of memory. There are moments in which memories are latent, shall we say, and then conjunctures that spark the remembering of certain pasts in particular ways. But if I may just open a bracket regarding something you said about, and apropos of memories of our own discipline of anthropology and the village becoming at a certain point this irrelevant space. And one wonders if perhaps what you just described, the neoliberal transformation, the seeming retraction of the state, also might have given anthropologists at that time the feeling that that's not where the future is happening. That's not where the emergent is happening. And yet, one can map the global, as we know from many studies, from the village. So on the one hand, you said that the village was seemingly kind of a space of classic anthropological study. But on the other hand, you do show in the book that the ethnic group Betsy-Missaraka, who were in the village and so on, they were relocated there, that the village itself had a history that was more complex than the romantic village of classic anthropology.
Right, totally. I mean, part of, it was there, like literally people had, the colonial state had come in and they didn't want, so historically, Betsy-Missaraka had been slash and burn agriculturalists. So they would go to their fields and they would, stay in their fields when they were planting rice because it's far to them and it, gets dark early, you have to walk out to them. And so they would stay in their fields. And then in particular ritual seasons, they'd come into the village, but villages were very small and they're an acephalous group. They're not a hierarchical group. And people like to say, like, we don't have any kings. We're too difficult for that. Each man is king in his own house. That's what they like to say. And so what the French did to make labor recruitment easy was to regroup them, right? So in some ways, like the past was there in the same way that the past is there in laws for us, right? Or in the organization of the streets, right? Or in all these kinds of ways. But that at those particular moments, it wasn't as if that was relevant to people. It was just the past that you walk on, like, the street you walk on, it's culture that gets kind of incorporated in the present, right?
So one example that you already outlined clearly is that of the elections. The elections as intense political moments when certain possibilities open up and people compete for them, and in the resulting violence or tension, memories come back. But another set of central sites for memory making in your study are pertaining to ancestors, sacrifice, and ritual.
So the two are intimately related, right? So I think that the way, so Betsy-Missaraka, Malagasy generally, but the group I was working with, have a set of practices around ancestors. And this goes back to Hallbox, right? So your ancestors are what give you power in the present, right? People would say. And you need to commemorate them. But the commemoration is literally in the practices of every day. So the people I worked with would literally say, we are the ancestors' standing stones. And standing stones are these huge megaliths that people erect. But on the East Coast, where it's very rainy and, things don't, like there's cyclones, buildings get blown down, right? It's the people who are the memory, right? They have an embodied memory. And there are many practices that Malagasy have that are related to that. I mean, partly about the placement of houses, partly about taboos, what you can't eat, what you can eat, right? And so people would say, we are the ancestors' standing stones. We, enact their memory. And these are older people. I have to say, I just want to be clear that during this period, I was really working with older people and men, although I was very close to some women, and that led into my later work in some ways. I have a lot of, passive knowledge that came from that.
Because people started out migrating from the village, the younger people already at that point.
Oh yeah, totally. But I couldn't see that. Yeah, of course.
You couldn't?
You couldn't see it because
they were not there.
They were not there, and I was focused on what was going on in the village, right? But then I'd say, like, well, where, when I started to go to the town to work, they were like, oh yeah, we have tons of people there. I'm like, you do? Sort of, and it was just, people were, it seemed obvious to them, I think. But the memories of ancestors and the focus on sort of making a living and the relationship to ancestors really worked as a filter that filtered the colonial past in such a way that it wasn't particularly relevant, and it only became relevant in particular moments. And I think that's the same everywhere. I think it's a very general phenomenon. I happen to show it through this exotic location, but I don't think the principles that I'm talking about are really particularly exotic in some ways. Right?
So then there is this element of memory that is mundane, that's there in the everyday life, pertains to the passing down of certain restrictions, taboos, rules, and so on. What about sacrifice? Is this something that is, especially for our audience, who members who haven't necessarily read your book, is this something that is ritualized time-wise? It happens all the time in a certain cyclicity, or is it also somehow like the memories brought about by election, organized in particular moments of tension or distress or uncertainty? Or
so cattle sacrifice, first of all, is just for the audience, it's practiced through many parts of Africa. It is a classic ritual practice, and Malagasy will say quite literally that cattle were made to pay for the sins of living people. And so when they kill a cow and ask for the ancestors to come and to eat with them, right? So literally it echoes much classic anthropology. They'll say, we're going to eat the cooked, and here you're going to eat the cooked and the raw. And they literally talk like that. And they'll take sort of the blood of the cow. And if someone's, broken a taboo, they'll mark their face, for example. Those practices, I think, were, extraordinarily important, but they were organized when something went wrong. So people don't walk around, I should say, people are supposed to be worrying about their ancestors, but in fact, they're just living their lives. And in living their lives, they want to do tons of things that the ancestors haven't done. So they're going around living their lives, and then they get sick, and they're like, oh my God, I forgot they don't say that, but oh my goodness, I forgot my ancestors, right?
Yeah.
And they'll go to a diviner, and the diviner will say, well, look, you better do something about that, right? And so it's always punctual, right? It's always, and they might say, okay, now I can't have a cow, I can't pay for a cow now. I can't afford it now. But as soon as I can, I'm going to make me better, cure me. And as soon as I can, I will sacrifice a cow for you. So it's something that can happen. It usually happens in September, October. It usually happens, that's when the rice harvest is coming in and people have money. And a very important point is that people need money to do ancestral rituals. Like custom and tradition, you have to have money to do them. If you don't have money, you can't do it, right? So people would do it. It would be punctually related to things. It was not something that was like Christmas, right? Although there are other things like New Year's, there are other things that are punctual, right? Or that are cyclical in that way. But this is very specific, right, to what's going on in a family. Then, however, because the cost is a lot, if you have a family member who's making a sacrifice, you can do things with that sacrifice because you will have given some little money and some little contribution in exchange for which you get blessing, right? And in doing that, so one cow, one sacrificial bull can be used to sort of cleanse and rework a ton of different social relations, right?
Within that family.
Within that family, only within that family. Yeah. Major, almost like a major therapy session, right? Where everybody's sort of working out their differences, apologizing for things, asking for blessings, saying, I did this, but I regret doing that, right? Now, because there are those moments of tension, of hopefully of forgiveness, right? But because you also then call the ancestors among you, there are also moments of incredible danger. So groups split up at that time too, right? So you would think they were planning for a major summit. You would think like when they're planning these things, there's a kind of fear and excitement all at once. Now, fear and excitement are things that heighten memory, right? And so in the moment of the cattle sacrifice, what they do is that they will, first of all, people are completely hyped up. They drink, they run around, people sing. There are lots of ritual sequences to it, right? But then there's a speech maker and he narrates. He says, do you know why you, the assembled, we're killing the bull today? This is why we're killing the bull today. So-and-so did this, and we washed that with the cow. So-and-so did that, and we washed with the cow. And so that re-narrates the memory, right? So after 1947, after this rebellion, there were sacrifices held, right? because people had to redress and had to kind of reshape their relationships with one another, right? And that's very, very important. It was a kind of, it was a moment of redress.
But it's interesting to hear that actually, we shouldn't think of these in some sort of instrumental form, that, the means of redress are there and redress will happen. Actually, it's open possibility. Redress might happen, but the opposite might happen too. You can fall apart.
Totally. I mean, it's really, and the word Betsmasaraka, I've always loved this, means the many who will not be sundered. It's always been a slogan because it's very divisive, right? Because the group is so fragmented, it's very hard to get people to agree, right? There's no huge means of control. One of the means of control is ancestors, right?
Yeah.
Because you have to go back and be buried together, and that keeps people tied together, but you can also break that group apart. When you have the means, you can break apart and set up your own ritual pull where you kill sacrifice cows and do that. So it's extraordinarily fraught. I almost felt like all politics were put into those rituals. There was nothing simple about it.
The possibility of fragmentation was there at all times.
Yeah. Huge.
You brought up burial. So I wonder if there is something to be said here also about death, burial practices as they relate to memory, and maybe the materiality of death and the dead in this context.
So one of the things that Madagascar are famous for in the ethnographic record, right? I mean, for people who are, of course, it's the animals and lemurs, right? But it's also the practice of reburial, which partly comes from Southeast Asia. People in Madagascar they settled from a mix of Southeast Asia and Africa. And so when somebody dies, it's the bones of the ancestors that hold hasana, that hold the power of the ancestors. And that hasana it's a very unstable force. It's a life force, right? A lot like mana that can dissipate. And you need to kind of regroup it and take care of it. And you also need to make it alive and good by honoring it in these ways. So when people die, they're buried a first time. And then when the flesh falls off their bones, the descendants of the ancestors come together. And again, the timing of that is, it's calendrial, right? It's a certain amount of time people know, but it's also dreams. People start to dream that the ancestors are cold, right? And that they need to be cared for. And someone will usually fall sick and then go to a diviner. And so people go and they disinter the ancestors, they rebury, they wrap them up, and they rebury them. And those events as well, and there's a cattle sacrifice that goes with that as well. Okay. Those events as well are major moments of group tension, of literally reconstructing the group and bringing it back together, right? That are very, very important. And also affirming your relationship to those particular ancestors.
Both as a kin group, but also as a rather collective community.
No, as a kin group. But then, so one of the things that was very interesting, and I'm not sure the degree, I think it exists in various ways across Madagascar, but you've got the kin group, right? They're the ones who have to do the reburial. But in order for anything to happen in Madagascar, someone else has to recognize that it's happened. Yeah. It's almost like a tree doesn't fall alone in the forest. It didn't fall, and so the group, the rest of the community will be there and they'll be witnesses, right? Yeah. And there's a kind of dialectic between the witnesses who are there and the people who are doing the work. And they have to collaborate. They have to commemorate together to make the memory happen, to make the remembering happen, to reconstitute the group.
So you said that at the beginning, when you started this research project, the absent youth or the migrating youth were not the obvious category because they weren't around, and you were interested in the sociology of this community. But in your subsequent projects, they became the focus. You had a project in the town of Tamatov where young women, questions of aging, transactional sex, religion became central. And now transnationally also with Malagasy women moving to France. And it begs the question about, maybe a twofold question, an ethnographic side of it being, to what extent are these particular practices of memory important to those women who leave, and not just women, young Malagasy folks in towns and who move transnationally, or to what extent other practices of memory become important, and to what extent your own interest in memory in this early book has resurfaced in the subsequent work.
Right. So in my work in Tamatave, I was working with young people, and they were not focused on the past. They really could have cared. They knew things about ancestors sometimes, but it was very variable. It really depended on where they'd grown up. And one of the things you have to realize is that the taboos and the relationship with ancestors are tied to land, and they're tied usually, in this case, to rural land, right? So if you spent a lot of time going to your grandma and grandpa's, you might, like on vacation, you might know stuff. If you were in the city far away and you didn't really go home that much, you might not know stuff, right? It was very much place-based, and sort of the traditional notions of power in Madagascar are very geocentric and geolocalized, right? So you're not going to follow taboos in the city necessarily, right? Unless they're maybe related to spirit possession or something. You're not. It's going to be. So it's sort of, and they also, Malagasy have a saying, which is essentially like, when in Rome, do like the Romans. It's the colors of the land are taken by the potato, or the colors of the land are taken by the hedgehog. Yeah. They have a rural idiom for it, but it's basically when in Rome. So if you're going to live in the city or going to live in France, you're going to behave. You're going to adapt. And so it makes them very good migrants, right? But at the same time, your searching abroad, right, for example, for migrants, is only going to go well if you retain the blessings of the ancestors. So there's still moments when the ancestors are going to call you back home, right, in a very, very powerful way. Now, in Tamatave, when people were going to school and had much more schooling, the rebellion and French colonialism and 1947, that's the national tragedy in Madagascar. Yeah. Like, that's the struggle for independence, right? So that was taught in schools, and they were taught a particular memory of it tied to the political party that was very important, called the MDRM, which was true for the people that I worked with in the peasants, but the peasants were much more anti-state more generally, right? So current young people in the city, it wouldn't have been as relevant for them, but who's to say if it won't become relevant to them, at some point in the present, because it really depends on what claims they want to make, right? And just to get to the urban, so I've been working with women who marry Frenchmen and migrate to France. Now, for those particular women, right, the history of the rebellion and French colonialism, that's not particularly relevant for them. Right. But their ancestors are very relevant. Like, they're still going to, at least for this generation. Now, whether their children will find it relevant, where those women will end up being buried, how that will work, I'm not going to predict. Yeah. But for the women, they still go home. Now, there also, though, are other people who are in some ways more educated, more invested in the debates around post-colonialism in French society. And I think they're getting very interested in 1947, right? And so I think, again, it comes back to the insight that the group, what group you are and what the politics and interests of the group are going to shape in some ways what the memories are.
And it's interesting how actually transnational migration and migration within national borders and so on starts reanimating and regenerating memory practices in all kinds of unexpected ways. Mm-hmm. Jennifer, thank you so much for being on this podcast. It was great talking to you. And for our audience members who are interested to learn more about the politics of memory in post-colonial contexts, we highly recommend Forget Colonialism by Jennifer Cole.